I'm going to introduce our 1 o'clock presenter, and this is Daniel Herriges. And I'll just admit that this is a very exciting presentation for me. Daniel is the co-founder of an organization called Strong Towns. I imagine that a lot of the people on this call know about Strong Towns. Probably a lot also don't know about Strong Towns. It's started maybe 10, 15 years ago as a blog from a disaffected traffic engineer named Chuck Marone, and grew into an organization that today I kind of think of as a think tank, although it's a think tank that has its feet very firmly planted on the ground. And they are kind of a voice in the wilderness, calling attention to the ultimately the unsustainability of the development paradigm or pattern that's predominated American planning in the last 60 or 70 years or so. And they do it from a qualitative perspective, kind of the biopsychosocial, even spiritual aspect of it. Qualitatively, just the things that we as planners see as lacking beauty and lacking human scale. And then they also very robustly look at things from a quantitative perspective, and I think very convincingly attach numbers to those concerns. So let me get to Daniel's more formal bio here. Daniel is the co-founder of Strong Towns and the senior editor. He has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Minnesota, with a concentration in housing and community development. He grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, before moving west to the San Francisco Bay Area and later east to Sarasota, Florida, where he lives with his wife, daughter, and too many pets, which begs the question, Daniel, how many pets is too many pets? So that's your first question. But then we'll just turn it over to you, and we will sort of collect questions and comments as people text them in and hit them with you at the end. So thank you, Daniel, very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me all right?
We sure can.
Great. Okay. Like calling me the co-founder of Strong Towns does a little bit too much credit, but I'll take it. I am a founding member. There are a number of us who were kind of on board early on, who found this Disaffected Traffic Engineers blog and were taken with it for one or more reasons and really built a community around this set of ideas. But I've been honored to be involved with Strong Towns for about 8 years now, and working for the organization for 3 as senior editor, as you said. So yeah, as David mentioned in his introduction, I'm the senior editor of Strong Towns, and we are an organization that is dedicated to supporting a model of development for North America that leads to resilient and financially solvent places. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means and what our vision looks like. Let me just tab over to my slides here. The traditional model of development, the model that is responsible for almost any city you can think of today, if you go back far enough, is one that was incremental and one that started with virtually nothing, people who had virtually nothing bootstrapping from what they did have. So this is a grainy photo from about 1870 of the city of Brainerd, Minnesota, which is up in the North Woods of Minnesota. It was built by, as my friend and colleague Chuck Marone likes to say, illiterate lumberjacks. And it started as essentially the row of shacks that you see here. And a lot of towns like this were not successful, but a lot were. By 30 years later, Brainerd looked like this. You see the initial really humble shacks replaced by much more permanent structures. You see a whole lot of people. This was Main Street, Brainerd, in the year 1904. And the town continued to evolve and grow incrementally to the point where by the 1930s, you have something that looks like this, and you can see the infrastructure improvements, the improvements to the public realm that accompanied the increased amount of private wealth concentrated in this city. So you now have curbs, you can see a manhole cover in the middle of the intersection. And this was a place that was steadily growing in both public and private wealth. And those two things were growing in tandem. So the public investment was funded by the private wealth and supported it in a virtuous cycle. Brainerd at the time had about 13,000 inhabitants. It still has about that many today. Its population growth has plateaued. But this is what the same location looks like today. And this is a familiar story to all too many towns and cities and neighborhoods across North America. Brainerd's core has dramatically hollowed out. A lot of those old buildings are gone. They're replaced by parking lots or not a whole lot of anything at all. And that virtuous cycle of incremental growth really stalled out. And so the question is, look at this as a crime scene. What happened? And what happened is a series of systemic changes that we at Strong Towns refer to as the Suburban Experiment, because it's a way of lumping together a number of linked phenomena. There's no one thing, there's no one culprit, but there was what amounted to a radical experiment, an unprecedented experiment in how we developed and financed and built our places. And this experiment was undertaken all at once over a very short period of time across an entire continent. You can think of the suburban experiment as a shift in the way we build cities from something that more resembled a complex system, like think of an old growth rainforest, and a shift away from that model. So if you think of the traditional pattern of human development, like this hillside town that you can see pictured on the right here, it is complex and it is adaptive. It is built by many hands over a long period of time, and the result is something that isn't master planned, that is often quite chaotic, but that has a logic that comes out of a direct response to the needs of the people living there over a long period of time. Complex is not the same thing as complicated. Complicated is a Rube Goldberg machine. Complicated is a technological system where you might need a lot of expertise. There might be a lot to understand about how it works, but it's possible to understand in its entirety. It is not something that is guided by many, many, many hands, but ultimately by a few. In ecological terms, a complex system is something like an old growth rainforest. A complicated system, something that is merely complicated, is more like monocultural agriculture, a cornfield versus a rainforest. Something where we've simplified the inputs, we've simplified the outputs, but we've created a system that has a whole lot less diversity and a whole lot less adaptability. The cornfield is less resilient to disruption. It can be disrupted by a pest, by a drought, by a flood, because it is monocultural, it is simple, and it is less productive. Ultimately, this cornfield is an efficient way of producing one thing, corn, but there's a lot less biomass in any sort of monocultural system than there is in a complex ecosystem that has had a long time to develop. The urban equivalent is the difference between the Italian hillside town that has existed in some form for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and the development pattern of the suburban experiment, where the financing is streamlined and predictable, the designs are streamlined and predictable. It's a simple set of inputs and a simple set of outputs, and it can be replicated by a large top-down enterprise or entity. The suburban experiment involved a massive horizontal expansion of our cities by way of a massive expansion of transportation infrastructure. The flagship piece of this, of course, was the interstate highway system in the 1950s. But accompanying that was a whole new pattern of development on the land in which we tended to hollow out the traditional cores of our cities. We tended to run freeways right through them. This photo is from Kansas City. The construction of the loop around downtown, which locals referred to at the time as Kansas City's Blitz, because the scale of the devastation was reminiscent of the London Blitz. And what this transportation system enabled was a pattern of development that could spread very rapidly and in a very orderly fashion across the landscape, but that was fundamentally monocultural. We know how to do this. We know how to do it very quickly. We can do it through very large-scale enterprises and with large-scale financing. And our zoning systems, our whole regulatory apparatus has been reshaped around this model of development. It is possible to achieve growth extremely rapidly through this suburban model. This series of maps illustrate the progression over time of the municipal boundaries of Fresno, California. And what we can see during the incremental era, starting in 1897, we see the city grow through small additions here and there, responding to population growth, tacking on to its original form. And here we are at 1946. And if you were to visit this part of Fresno today, you would find an area with a compact street grid, with mixed-use development, with a pretty strong intensity of development, following that traditional growth pattern. And then post-1946, we see here Fresno in 1958, 1970, 1983, 95, 2010. And by the way, in Fresno's case, and this is common in the West, these are the municipal boundaries. This is annexation happening. But even in places that don't have that history of annexation, where instead you have independent suburbs incorporating themselves, you see a similar explosion in horizontal growth enabled by mass automobile ownership and mass automobile infrastructure. Just an absolute explosion in the horizontal footprint of our cities during the era of the suburban experiment. Accompanying that is an explosion in the amount of public infrastructure that we have committed to maintain. These figures are from a case study that Strong Towns did along with Urban 3, which is a planning consultancy out of Asheville, North Carolina. We did a case study of Lafayette City and Parish in Louisiana, where we looked at the growth of their footprint and their public infrastructure obligations over time. So between 1949 and 2015, Lafayette's population grew by a factor of 3.5. The number of feet of pipe, water and sewer pipe, per resident of Lafayette grew tenfold in the same time. This is not the total footprint, this is per person, from 5 feet per person to 50. The number of fire hydrants grew by a factor of 21.4. And you can see similar patterns all over the continent. Lafayette is a typical mid-sized city here. I realize that I'm speaking now to a conference that is at least nominally in a different Lafayette, but just a little nod to that. Median household income in Lafayette, Louisiana grew by a factor of 1.6 during that same period, in which the infrastructure commitment ballooned by far, far more than that. It's not hard to see the problem here. And we can see this at the scale of individual local projects everywhere we look. We've done a few case studies over the years. We've published and written about them on our website. From a local street project where if you take the taxes coming in from the properties that are served by a road improvement, and you look at how much revenue is going to public works, how much revenue is going potentially to maintenance of this road, you find that it would take 37 years simply to recoup the public contribution to this project from the adjoining tax base. A lot of pavement doesn't last 37 years. You look at a local cul-de-sac, this is a street that is only serving local traffic, and you find that it would take 79 years, this case study is on our website, to recoup the public expense from the taxes generated by the adjoining properties. And to simply break even just on the road maintenance would require a 46% increase in property tax rates on those properties. So this is not something that can be sustained. When you scale this up over many, many public works projects across a whole city or a whole region, what you get is what we call the growth Ponzi scheme. Not a Ponzi scheme in the sense of illegal activity, in the sense of a nefarious plot, but a Ponzi scheme in the sense of the economics. As you build according to this horizontal pattern, when the infrastructure is new, it needs very little maintenance, and you have generated outward growth, you've generated economic activity, and the cash flow looks very, very good through the first life cycle. And then you start to need to do maintenance on these projects. Many times the infrastructure was paid for by a private developer or by a federal grant up front. The maintenance almost never is. That's almost always a local responsibility. And so as these maintenance bills come due, here's what happens to your cash flow. even if you are continuing to get some outward growth, you become overwhelmed by the obligations of maintaining everything that you've built. And we see city after city after city in this predicament. In the case of our Lafayette case study, what we found is that right now the median house in Lafayette costs roughly $150,000 and pays about $1,500 a year in property taxes. To maintain just the roads and drainage systems that have already been built, the family in that median house would need to have their taxes increase by $3,300 per year just to tread water. This is a sewer main break in Tampa, Florida, where the city has recently announced a $3.2 billion plan to repair and upgrade its water and sewer systems. This is a graph from the city of Tampa in announcing this plan, where you can see the contrast between the money available for capital projects at existing rates versus the project that they are endeavoring to fund, which will be funded through a combination of about half and half dramatic water rate hikes and debt. This predicament is typical of aging cities all over the continent. We built and built and built without rigorously doing the math as to what we could maintain. And now those maintenance costs are overwhelming us. If we look down at the scale of an individual block, we can start to understand the contours of this problem. We can start to understand that what we have is a pattern of development that doesn't pay its way. This is an aerial shot of Brainerd, Minnesota. And here we have two blocks highlighted. And the one on the left is a block built prior to the suburban era of small scale buildings, not a lot of off-street parking. And these buildings are not in great shape. They house kind of marginal local businesses. There's a barber shop, there's a liquor store, marginally productive local businesses. The buildings need some work. 2 blocks to the right, what we have is a fast food drive-through franchise called Taco John's, which received a 26-year TIF subsidy from the city to go in here, and replaced a block of old, somewhat dilapidated buildings very similar to the one on the left. Here are the photos. You can see the what we call in tongue-in-cheek the old and blighted block, because that's how this place was perceived locally. And the Taco John's, the shiny and new auto-oriented fast food franchise. The city was very proud of landing this Taco John's. It would serve traffic headed to the surrounding lake country. The resorts around there. They figured it would bring in tax base, it would be new jobs, and it would modernize what was seen as a blighted part of town. The only problem comes when you actually do the math and you look at the value of these properties, because that block of old rundown storefronts is worth a total of about $1.1 million. And the new fast food restaurant occupying the same land area is worth $618,000. That old and blighted block is generating more taxes year after year for the city than the shiny and new auto-oriented block. And this pattern scales up. You look at, you look at a big box store, its accompanying parking, its out parcels, versus a traditional downtown full of a granular pattern of small storefronts, maybe some apartments on top. That traditional development pattern substantially outperforms the auto-oriented pattern in terms of concentrated land value per acre. This was a study done in Sarasota County, Florida, where I live, by Urban 3, where they looked at prototypical examples of different development patterns that exist throughout Sarasota County. And again, they looked at the tax yield per acre from these development patterns. And what you see, this may be hard to read. There's a lot of fine print on this slide. Single family homes, some multifamily at the top, and then you have commercial uses, a Walmart supercenter generating about $8,000 in taxes per acre per year. You have a mall, you have a Burger King, And then when you get to the bottom, you get to the green bars, you have the absolute explosion of value corresponding to places in downtown Sarasota that are mixed use buildings designed at the human scale, engaging the pedestrian, have some height, have some intensity, and they absolutely blow that auto-oriented development pattern out of the water in terms of the revenue yield per acre. And per acre is an important metric here because a lot of our infrastructure costs scale per acre of land, not per capita. You build something, you need to service it with pipes, you need to service it with pavement. Urban 3 has done study after study all over the continent. And what they find when they look at tax yield per acre, when they look at value per acre, is a very consistent pattern in which the places that overwhelmingly provide the wealth in a community are the places developed according to a traditional pedestrian-oriented pre-suburban development pattern. This is Buffalo, New York. The same pattern exists in much smaller towns. Here is Williamsville, New York. Manchester, New Hampshire. That purple in the center, that is the traditional downtown of Manchester. Bozeman, Montana. In all of these cases, the extruded bars here represent value per acre, where you have the volume of a bar is going to represent the total value contribution to the city. But the height of the bar is representing the value per acre because land is the thing they're not making more of. And this shows the way value is concentrated everywhere we have a traditional pre-suburban development pattern. Redlands, California, Lancaster, California. All over this same pattern. When you visit these places on the ground, this is Lafayette, Louisiana again, what you see is a fine-grained pattern of development. You see a modest public infrastructure footprint. You tend to see narrow streets. The photo on the bottom is a poor neighborhood close to downtown Lafayette, Louisiana. The houses are small, they're not all in great repair. This is a low-income area. It performs quite well on value per acre because the lots are small, the streets are narrow, and the infrastructure was developed in a very modest way using the natural terrain, for example, as opposed to expensive pumping systems. You look at the suburban pattern, overwhelmingly where you see the red on these maps, this is what you see. You see areas where development is spread out and where the public infrastructure footprint is far more substantial relative to the private wealth. Another thing you see, everywhere you see those tall bars on Urban 3's maps, everywhere you see concentrated value per acre, if you go there, you see people on foot. You see people milling about, patronizing businesses, hanging out, drinking a coffee. People, we can say, are the indicator species of a successful place. And that's true in large cities, and it's true at a neighborhood scale, and it's true in much smaller places. People are the indicator species of success. So what is the Strong Towns vision? There are a few components to it. And we always stress that it is a way of thinking and a way of asking questions about how we produce a productive, resilient place. The Strong Towns approach is not a set of cookie cutter policy prescriptions that can be copied and pasted from one town to the next. But it starts in that recognition that the places that are delivering an outsized share of our wealth and our financial productivity today are places that were built according to the traditional incremental development pattern, in which people created a place with what they had, and then as the wealth grew and concentrated in that place, they expanded upon it. They expanded upon a simple, adaptable template of human-scaled streets, pedestrian-oriented storefronts, mixed-use buildings. So one thing that cities need to do in order to regain that fiscal strength is to re-allow that process of incremental development in places where it is essentially currently disallowed by zoning and by other barriers. Every neighborhood should allow the next increment of development by right, without an extensive approval process, unpredictable delays, high unpredictable costs. You should be able to walk into City Hall, and if you want a permit to replace a single family house with a duplex or a fourplex or convert it into one, you should be able to walk out with that permit relatively simply. If you want to build a neighborhood serving small business on a small lot, you should be able to do so relatively simply. We need to turn our attention away from expanding our places outward through large scale finished state monocultural development. And instead now we need to focus on allowing our places to thicken up in the areas where there already is development, they are already served by infrastructure. But what we need is more productivity out of that development pattern. This doesn't mean that we subject neighborhoods to radical change. It means that no neighborhood gets to be exempt from change. We thicken up incrementally at a scale that allows the people who already live in a place and are invested in a place to contribute to the process. This means lowering the bar to entry to be a town maker, to be someone who contributes to developing the place where you live. We think of development as something done by developers with a capital D, often with Wall Street financing. And the model is either, the large production builder that does a subdivision on the edge of town, or the large urban builder that assembles a whole block's worth of lots, demolishes what was on them, and puts up a 5/1 apartment complex. That's not how we historically built our places. It was possible to go in and buy a single urban lot and build small, modest houses on modest lots, accessory dwelling units, cottages in the backyard of a house, small scale commercial options. This photo is from Muskegon, Michigan. We, every spring we run a Strongest Town contest where Strong Towns readers and members can nominate their town. They can provide a whole application demonstrating ways in which they are embracing the Strong Towns approach. And then our readers can vote on a Strongest Town. And Muskegon won the Strongest Town contest back in 2018. And one of the things that was really eye-popping about what they had done was the city of Muskegon has some post-industrial blight in its downtown. They had a lot of vacancy. And they went to, the city went and it looked at some land that it had acquired in the core of downtown Muskegon that was sitting idle. And they said, we could hunt around for a big developer who's going to do a big project on this lot, but we don't think the market is there for that yet. But we know that we have local entrepreneurs who would like a little bit of space to take that first tiny step in growing a business. And so Muskegon put up these pop-up shops on city-owned land, and they allowed local businesses to rent them out. It's sort of, it's a little bit more permanent than a tent at a farmer's market, but not a whole lot more. And the experiment drew a bunch of foot traffic downtown. It allowed some of these businesses to get a start and ultimately graduate to a brick and mortar location. And it put to use land that was lying fallow and ultimately helped jumpstart the process of a pedestrian renaissance downtown, where it was now a destination where people would want to come. And ultimately what you do is you create the market for more permanent, larger, more elaborate forms of development. This idea of lowering the bar to entry to the absolute smallest increment of adaptation, whether it is a tiny little pop-up storefront for your local business, whether it is an accessory cottage attached to your house or in your backyard or above your garage so that your aging parents can move in there, or so that you can rent it out and have an income stream. These are the minimum bar to entry that allow people to participate in co-creating their places, and that allow neighborhoods that have been neglected by the suburban model of development, by the suburban experiment, to begin to thicken back up. I recently had the opportunity to write about a fascinating case study in this from your own state, from the city of South Bend, where there is a rapidly growing ecosystem, and this is the word they use, of small scale developers and rehabbers in South Bend, doing projects such as this, the Ward Baking Company building on the northwest side of South Bend has been abandoned for a number of years, and it is currently being renovated into a business incubator that will have room for, I believe, 60 small businesses to occupy affordable temporary space. This is in a neighborhood of South Bend that is low income, that has had a lot of problems with vacancy, that was historically redlined. And what made this project possible was a group of developers working on the model of what they call their farm. Several different developers are doing small scale projects within an area of a few blocks, which they've dubbed Portage Midtown in near Northwest South Bend. And they started really simple. They started with some renovations of existing homes in the area, and partnering with Habitat for Humanity to create a few energy net zero homes. And what this did was it proved the market. It created comparables for property appraisers. So this is a neighborhood where historically any sort of redevelopment has been stymied by an appraisal gap, where no bank was willing to issue a loan for a property that they didn't believe would be worth enough to justify the renovation. And the way you overcome that is little by little. It's not through dramatic redevelopment, it's through unleashing incremental effort to thicken up a place that has a bunch of gaps. And the bakery project is something that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago, and now it is with very minimal public subsidy because the market is beginning to be proven. In conjunction with an organization out of Portland, Small Development Counts, and the Congress for New Urbanism, a study was done of the projected value that was going to be created by this small development strategy over time. And what they found is, right now there's a group of developers working in this area in South Bend that together account for about 100 different lots that they own and are planning to do work on. You can see the orange line in this graph represents the tax revenue to the city per year that will be generated by these projects as they are built out. The green line represents a hypothetical scenario in which the city subsidized a large-scale developer with tax incentives to redevelop a bunch of these properties in one fell swoop. And what we see is that the large-scale development early on, between year 8 and 9, that's build out. And that's when that development starts paying municipal revenue, but it doesn't pay back the subsidy that was put in to jumpstart this, to catalyze it, until 2046. Meanwhile, small development is a little slower to get going, but it has paid for itself by year 15, and over time generates far more value for the city. And starting small, the key to starting small is that you can build incrementally and you can create momentum and you can create a snowball that starts rolling. This is what we need in thousands of neighborhoods all over North America. We need an incremental thickening up and reinvesting in places that we've already built. And it's not going to come by throwing money at the problem, and it's not going to come through a top-down approach that applies a standardized model of financing and model of development. It's going to come through unleashing incrementalism, through lowering the bar of entry. On the public sector side, there's a need to reorient how we think about public infrastructure and how we invest in it. We spent decades during the suburban era accommodating automobiles and thinking that this was going to generate growth. We are going to make it easy for people to get into the city. We're going to make it easy for them to commute out of the city. We're going to provide the capacity for transport and commerce, and this is going to generate growth. And it hasn't. It has generated very, very expensive liabilities, which growth has not been sufficiently productive to pay for. This type of road is extremely familiar all over North America. At Strong Towns, we coined the word strode to describe it. A strode is a hybrid of a street and a road. It's not the perfect term, but what it evokes is a compromise that ends up trying to do two things and doing neither of them well. So you can think about an urban street. The goal of an urban street is to be a platform for productive activity. A platform for people's homes, a platform for people's businesses, for people to do the stuff of life and to ultimately create wealth. So an urban street should prioritize access, and it should prioritize being an environment where people want to be. A high-speed road is a connection between two places. It prioritizes mobility rather than access. The goal is to get people from one productive place where they want to be to another productive place where they want to be, and to get them there quickly. What we have done all over North America since about the 1940s is we have built street road hybrids that are attempting to deliver both access and mobility at the same time. And what they do is they deliver both things terribly. You have enough complexity in this environment to make it dangerous. There are a lot of potential conflict points between vehicles and other vehicles, between vehicles and pedestrians. It's a chaotic environment, but it also doesn't get you where you need to get quickly, because to control that chaos, we need a lot of signalized intersections. We need a lot of friction. So this fails as a high-speed connection, and it fails as a place where anyone in their right mind would want to voluntarily spend time. So this whole paradigm where you have transportation facilities that are designed to prioritize mobility and transportation facilities that are designed to prioritize access, that category in the middle is a value destroyer, and that is the strode. Strodes are also the most dangerous environments. You can go to any city and you can look at where fatal crashes occur. And they occur on strodes. They occur at speeds of about 40, 45 miles per hour on wide roads with a lot of potential conflict points between users. The strode is an absolute value killer. They are the worst public investments that we can make in our cities. And we have a generation's worth of work ahead of us retrofitting these places. And that retrofit can go in one of two directions. You can convert a strode into a street, or you can convert it into a road. If your goal is an urban street, if you have a place that is a destination, then what you want to do is design this place according to that lesson that people are the indicator species of success. You need to prioritize those who are going to be in the place, using the place, engaging with it. And this means you slow traffic way down to speeds where a collision is very unlikely to be fatal. You prioritize the movement and the activity of people on foot, on bikes, on wheelchairs, public transit over automobiles. You intensify the adjacent land use. You make it a destination. You allow the private owners of that land to do so. And ultimately, you embrace the complexity in that environment. The last person who should design a street is a traffic engineer. Engineers are very good at designing roads. It is a predictable environment. There are the attributes that make for a successful road that allow vehicles to navigate them safely and smoothly. That's the engineer's domain. If you're going to design a successful road, you want to limit access to a small number of access points. You want to segregate automobiles from other modes so that they can move in a smooth and predictable and safe environment. You do not allow the adjacent land use to degrade the capacity or the function of that road. You don't want a ton of curb cuts. You don't want a ton of complexity. The point of a road is to get people between productive places. So you simplify. The point of a street is to create a complex environment where the full diversity of urban life can thrive. And so that's something where the design needs to be extremely situational, and it needs to ultimately prioritize and be driven by the people who will be using the space, and not by concerns about level of service or the movement of traffic or congestion. This calls for a different approach to public investment than the one we have made that is heavy on standards and formulas and guidebooks. It calls for an approach that ultimately responds to how people use the city. We need to obsessively look for where the people who already live in a place are struggling and meet those needs. And that's something we can do very rapidly, and we can do it incrementally, and we can create the potential for more and more value. We can create virtuous cycles over time. And we so often fail to do this under the paradigms of the suburban experiment. Witness these desire paths that are just screaming for a sidewalk. The investments that need to be made to do this are individually modest, but collectively, if we do hundreds and thousands of them, they are transformative. The public investment process for a strong town starts with humbly observing where people in the community struggle, and then asking, what is the next smallest thing we can do right now? Not after an elaborate study, not in 5 years, not after applying for a federal grant, right now to address that struggle. And we do that thing. We go out and we do it, and we empower our staff as cities and as other municipal authorities. We empower our staff to go out and get these things done quickly so that we can repeat that process and we can scale it. When we do this, we unlock virtuous cycles between public investment and private investment. This is Broad Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. This was a commercial corridor. You can see kind of historic storefronts here that fell on hard times in the late 20th century, in part because of the construction nearby of an elevated expressway that routed traffic around the neighborhood. And by the 2000s, Broad Avenue had a bunch of vacancies and was generally seen as blighted. And a group of local residents and business owners wanted to turn that around. And what they did in 2010, they brought in an organization called Better Block, based out of Dallas, Texas, that does tactical urbanism demonstration projects. Better Block will come in and they will help you transform your street in low-cost ad hoc ways for a day or for a weekend into a place with a whole lot more curb appeal, with a whole lot more pedestrian activity. You can set up pop-up storefronts. What you do is you create a model of what could this place be if we treat people as the indicator species of success. With some support from the city, Better Block came in and did a demonstration project on Broad Avenue. And what it has catalyzed is a remarkable revitalization of this corridor over the past decade. A number of the changes, including bike lanes, improved crosswalks, public art, were so popular that the city came in and found ways to make them permanent, versus what you see here, which is people who live and work in this corridor just striping them themselves as a demonstration. Many of the changes have since been made permanent. The resulting Broad Avenue Arts District, what they did was they really, in tandem with buy-in from the neighborhood businesses, created an attractive place, a place people want to be, a place that is safe for people to linger and pleasant for people to linger, and then built on that success. And so in a decade, we've had 29 either new properties built or properties renovated in this corridor of a few blocks of Broad, 50% increase in rents in what was a very blighted area, 25 new businesses, and over 15 million in new investment. You need local buy-in. You need the people who live in a place, who work in a place, who use a place to be doing this. And the public sector needs to support these activities and needs to work to facilitate them and needs to get out of the way, needs to lower the bar to entry. And this is the kind of activity that can inspire copycats in neighborhood after neighborhood. It is fundamentally local, it is fundamentally incremental, but it is the necessary process of thickening up places that have been left behind to create more value. My boss, my friend, my colleague, Charles Marone, a lot of what you've heard from, almost everything you've heard from me today has been his brainchild on some level, though these ideas have been inspired by a whole lot of people in this amazing community of strong towns advocates, this movement that we've been fortunate enough to be able to build. If you want to read more about these ideas, I would strongly recommend picking up Chuck's books. He's written two: Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. And most recently, just this September, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer was published, Transportation for a Strong Town. They're both great reads. They go far more in depth on a lot of what I've discussed today about both the Suburban Experiment and the path back from it. And then visit strongtowns.org. The primary thing that we do is we publish content. We publish articles, 10 to 15 every week. We do webinars. We have 3 podcasts. We have a Strong Towns Academy full of online courses. And we are constantly working to, not just to get this message out, but to build a community of people who are inspired by all of it or part of it, who can work with each other to create solutions that are adapted to where they live and what they need. And so I encourage you to check out our work, and I encourage you to join that community.
Daniel, I have one for you.
Sure.
You did mention South Bend, and I know that what's gone on there in the last few years, from what I've understood, it's been kind of initiated by some smaller scale developers who are pretty explicitly using, strong towns methods in terms of really even pushing for changes to zoning and subdivision code amendments, and the city, to their credit, has latched on and been a willing accomplice in that act. Have you found other municipalities, counties, cities, towns that have intentionally worked towards employing strong towns methods?
Yes, we have. South Bend is really an interesting case study right now, and it's been fascinating to learn more about. We have a good number. We hear all the time from elected officials, planning directors, people in municipal government all over the country. What I would say is, is there a place that is kind of the model of this is how you should be a strong town as a city? I don't think there's one. I think there are a bunch of fascinating experiments bubbling up, and a lot of them may be indirectly influenced by us, but not always explicitly inspired by us, and we're fine with that. One that I think different communities have hit upon different pieces of the puzzle. One that I would strongly encourage looking into is Fate, Texas. Fate is a small suburb kind of on the outskirts of the Dallas-Fort Worth metro, experiencing a lot of growth pressure right now. And the city staff in Fate developed a process for rigorously examining the fiscal return on new development that was proposed in Fate. And they incorporated this into their development review process, not as a set of boxes, as I understand it, that absolutely had to be ticked, but as something that was going to be brought into the discussion and brought to the table every single time. We have a webinar by the staff from Fate that on our website. The staff from Fate developed this process for estimating the ratio of new public investment to new private investment for proposed development in Fate, with the notion inspired by strong towns that you need the ratio of private to public to be high enough to have a place that over time is going to generate the revenue required to do all the maintenance on the infrastructure that was put in and to maintain the level of service that's expected by residents. So Fate is an interesting case study. Bastrop is another city in Texas that redid their code a couple years ago to essentially provide for a grid plan of the sort that used to be ubiquitous all over the continent and is really rare nowadays. So, they looked at their code, they looked at their subdivision requirements and said, well, we want new development in Bastrop to occur on an extension of the city's existing grid. And accompanying this are essentially templates for accommodating stormwater and utilities within that grid in a way that is going to be scalable and that's going to build onto what already exists. And that isn't the Suburban Experiment model of let's get a large scale developer to do an entire self-contained subdivision of 2,000 homes, 1,000 homes, whatever. And that doesn't have a lot of contiguity with the surrounding city. So Bastrop, Texas is an interesting experiment to look at. In the case of South Bend, what's really happening is a focus on revitalizing blighted areas, areas that have been through a lot of decline within the city. And yes, the city staff, to their credit, have really engaged in this process. I would say it's been spearheaded by a cohort of small developers, many of whom live in these Northwest neighborhoods. Many of them are women and people of color who were just looking for, well, I need an affordable space for my business. I want to renovate a home I can live in. And then how can I give this experience to others? How can I help lift my neighbors up with me? But the city has created a department of engagement and economic empowerment to really be the one-stop shop for these people in terms of helping them navigate the bureaucracy, helping them navigate financing, helping identify obstacles to the small-scale local revitalization projects they want to do and say, well, what can we do to address this? They've done a bunch of work on their zoning code. They have eliminated their parking minimums citywide, which is probably the #1 regulatory barrier to almost all forms of infill, particularly incremental infill development. And that's something that's a national trend. And we actually have a crowdsourced map of dozens, probably verging on hundreds at this point, of cities across North America that have sharply curtailed or eliminated their minimum parking requirements. And we absolutely celebrate that change. So a lot of that I wouldn't try to take credit for. I think that is a movement that is larger than Strong Towns, but that we are happy to be a part of and happy to celebrate.
You mentioned Chuck Marone. I think Strong Towns and Chuck have both sort of elevated profiles and really maybe surrounding this book, but you've written op-eds in national newspapers and there's interviews on CNN and all this. And a question that gets frequently asked is, what do you think of the infrastructure bill or the coming package? And what I've heard Chuck say is swimming upstream from what I hear most other people saying. Could you just share from a Strong Towns perspective your thoughts about this massive infrastructure bill that seems to be coming?
Yeah, the federal conversation about infrastructure tends to be really fixated on dollar amounts. You can see that in all the national press coverage of the bills that have been on the table recently. How many trillion are we going to spend and where are they going to go? And fundamentally, I think the Strong Towns answer is that is the wrong preoccupation. And it comes out of sort of that fundamental fallacy of the suburban experiment, which is, well, we can build infrastructure and we can generate growth. And yeah, you can build infrastructure and you can generate transactions. And the question that we're bad at asking is, what is the long-term return on investment of the things we're building? So we tend to be pretty strong skeptics of not of federal funding for infrastructure. Federal funding for infrastructure is necessary, but of a federally led process that is focused on dollar amounts of spending. We think that question of return on investment really is something that needs to be evaluated locally. And really, fundamentally, it needs to be driven by local needs as opposed to being driven by the availability of federal funding. So in that respect, the way cities plan and build infrastructure tends to be absolutely upside down. Especially in smaller towns, we see countless examples of cities more or less pushed into scaling up a project, building more capacity than they need, be it for sewer, wastewater, road, whatever, in order to score a federal grant that will allow them to do a project at all. And so that's a fundamentally broken model. And so will throwing more money at that system get us to Strong Towns? It might get us some really good pedestrian and bike infrastructure built. Yes, it might get us some good public transit projects built. And so a lot of people in the sort of ped bike transit world tend to look favorably on these big infrastructure bills because they think, well, it's the only way we're going to get our piece of the pie. We have not taken a stance for or against any of the Biden administration's bills, so much as we have said that the conversation is broken, and saying, well, how many trillions of dollars are we going to get and what are they going to be for, is ultimately, it doesn't help us answer the question of return on investment. And the way we answer that is we make decisions locally in accordance to local needs, and we identify those local needs through humble observation and through a pattern of how can we wring more productivity out of what we already have.
Do you see it being a possibility or a reality that cities taking strong towns or other newer stroke niche approaches to more authentic community growth may take an agenda of their own that is antithetical to strong town principles? I'm thinking more aggressive approaches to form-based code or other local ordinances that steer their development where, quote, they, unquote, want to see it go.
That's an interesting question. You know, I think the answer could be yes. I mean, I think that one thing that we try to do, and again, I don't know if this answers the question very well. I think one thing that we've tried to do at Strong Towns is emphasize questions to ask as opposed to rote answers to those questions, and ways of thinking. This is as much about process as it is about product. And so the whole bit about complex systems versus complicated systems was about that the point of incrementalism here is to create virtuous cycles in which you're identifying local needs constantly and you have a bias toward action and you're meeting them. And that tends to produce certain types of environments. From a Strong Towns perspective, it's backwards to look at the product and say, all we need to do is replicate this again and again. So, you know, I like form-based codes. I think form-based codes tend to enable forms of development that are a lot more responsive to community needs and that tend to be more productive. Are form-based codes the answer to the problems we've identified with the Suburban Experiment? Often no, and not everywhere. And this doesn't make any of those tools bad, but if you're fixated on the product, if you're fixated on, well, what we need is mixed use, what we need is density, let's just come up with a cookie cutter template for mixed use density, and then let's throw resources at making that happen. I think that ultimately isn't get us, it might get us some nice things. It might get us some nice development. It's not going to get us to resilience. It's not going to get us to the virtuous cycles that build places that can retain their resilience over time. One place that my mind goes with this question, we have been kind of iconoclastic in terms of, you know, new urbanists and some of the other folks that we tend to align with in this respect, but we've been critics of the development approach of Carmel, Indiana, outside of Indianapolis, as being maybe sort of the thing I'm talking about as a cautionary tale, where if you look at, well, what we need is density, we need walkability, we need mixed use. You can take the Carmel approach, which is to throw a whole lot of debt financing and a whole lot of public subsidy at making that happen. And you can create a place that is really nice and really pleasant to be. And I think the open question is, how does this fare over time? And how financially resilient is it over time?
From a Strong Towns perspective, when parking spaces are removed, what should be put in that space instead?
I think that is a local situational question. There are a lot of better uses of that space because parking tends to be just about the absolute least productive thing you can do with high value urban land. So I'm a big fan of the tactical urbanism experiments that you see in replacing replacing on-street parking with things like little parklets, with sidewalk seating for local businesses. There are a lot of kind of fun and even whimsical uses, you know, things you can do with this space that create a much more people-oriented environment. And actually, it's been fun to watch. Fun is maybe the wrong word. I don't ever want to make light of how hard the pandemic has been for everyone, but it's been interesting to watch a bunch of these experiments get a turbo boost from the pandemic, particularly in the middle of 2020, as cities said, well, how can we keep our local businesses afloat? And the answer was often, let's repurpose parking to create outdoor space that they and their customers can use. And a lot of these experiments have created really, really nice places, but there's no one template. It's kind of who are the people with a stake in this location and what do they want to see here? And I think the most important thing is allowing ad hoc experiments to happen. The question about parking minimums is a little different because that deals with off-street parking. And again, I think the big thing there is recognizing that parking is tremendously overbuilt in almost every city and town in North America. And a big part of that is because we legally require it to be. So removing minimums is just a matter of not dictating what would be more valuable than parking, but saying we trust the owners of a piece of land to figure that out for themselves, to decide how much parking they need and how they are going to weigh that need against other things they can do with the space.
Does strong towns have any resources or best practices specifically geared towards micromobility trends, such as bike share, dockless scooters, drones, autonomous delivery on sidewalks, etc.?
Best practices, not in such a formal sense, but we've certainly been watching those trends with interest. I think, if I were to try to articulate a best practice, it would go back to that process of incremental public investment and incremental adaptation to space, where you look at a need and you look at how can we meet this need through a low-cost ad hoc experiment that we can do right now, and then iterate on that, see how it works, see how people like it, do a lot of pilot projects. I think that on the whole, I think the micromobility trend is really, really positive, particularly as an adaptation to places that were designed around universal car ownership. Having access to a bike with an electric assist allows a whole lot of people who wouldn't ride a bike under normal circumstances to actually get around by one at suburban distances, to do some local errands, or to access public transit via this mode. I think the same thing with scooters, the same thing with a bunch of these little innovations. And the worst thing that a city can do is over-regulate it up front before the kinks have been worked out, or overreact to public unease with the effects of some of these things, and sort of shut down the experiment in its infancy. So I am all for a process of embracing these trends and addressing problems through low-cost ad hoc interventions. Be things with scooter parking, issues with them cluttering sidewalks, whatever the issue is, but addressing it in a hyper-local, low-cost way, and then looking at what works and doing more of that.
So us as MPOs, a lot of our work kind of focuses on plans. We have our documents, our metropolitan transportation plans, our tips. We work with these funding bills to, send funding to different projects. How can we negotiate between a strong towns approach of kind of more organic, in situ development versus, we need a 5-year plan for our funds? How are we spending them? How are we accountable? How are we, including public comment and involvement? Do you have a way to negotiate between those two approaches that we can kind of use in the short term?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't think I have a wholly satisfying answer for you. The MPO as an institution is part of this sort of upside down government food chain where cities are, this is a phrase from Chuck Marohn, but he says the implementing arm of state and federal policy, because that's where the money is coming from, and that's the way the planning systems are arranged. So I think that, that's not going away with the snap of a finger or anything. But I think there is a need to to do, I think a few things. I think reorienting public engagement in a way that is much more responsive to and aims to draw out actual community needs is really important. And this means making an effort to go beyond sort of the conventional public meeting or comment box kind of approach, or even online surveys that ask people to rank preferences, and to really embrace methods of public engagement that involve sort of direct observation of people's on the ground needs, and let that filter up into the process in terms of plans. I'm aware that that's vague, because I think a lot of this stuff is untested and needs to be developed ad hoc through particular project processes. And ultimately, you know, a lot of the solutions here are not going to come from within traditional bureaucracies, but I think there's a role for those bureaucracies in being much more thoughtful about public engagement and letting it drive a different set of priorities, and being willing to have those conversations, and also being willing to say no. I think that's the other thing, is that local transportation priorities shouldn't be strictly dictated by the availability of federal funding, to the point where a community gets pushed into doing something that isn't in its best interest because there's a grant for it, or compromising what should be the goals of a project in a deep way because there's a grant for it. And there is no one sort of template for how to do it differently. But there are times when the most important thing is to simply say, when you're in a hole, stop digging. You know, we're not gonna we're not gonna orient ourselves up the food chain to sort of the conventional top-down model of determining what gets built. And I'm afraid that I'm just gonna ramble if I keep talking here. I'm aware that that is a theoretical and not super satisfying answer in terms of on-the-ground practice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's something that I have trouble thinking about, which is why I asked you. Because yeah, I couldn't think of any good answer, any, you know, simple 5-10 minute answer to it either. So
it does strike me that public engagement can be the linchpin for better things happening. That if you that becomes a way to have conversations that haven't traditionally been had within the bureaucracies that make really important funding decisions in ways that are normally like less visible to the public and maybe less subject to the local democratic process. I think there's a need for a whole lot of creativity on that front.
Question: we are required as MPOs to consider the land use impacts of transportation policy and investment decisions. We could start by identifying those corridors that are stroads and prioritizing conversion back to city streets. We can show how land use patterns have changed with highway development from 1950 to 1960. Finally, we can look at our performance measures and targets. We should embrace accessibility over mobility. I guess that's more of a comment there than a question necessarily, but do you have any comment in response?
I really appreciate that comment, and I think, yeah, that is on the money. I think, you know, this is true of any sort of planning agency, to the extent that you are tasked with evaluating the impacts of what gets built and where, do so holistically, and, you know, insist on bringing those historically neglected considerations into the mix. So yeah, you know, doing an identification of where the stroads in your area, looking at the relationship between stroad design and crash rates and, you know, fatality rates on roads. I think that's huge. I think there are a lot of abandoning, you know, the focus on metrics such as level of service, where those metrics are not appropriate. I think that people within these bureaucracies have a lot of ability to push the conversation in a more holistic direction that accounts for some of these things.
Certainly. Looks like there was a small typo there. It was 1950 to 2020, not 1960. My apologies. Another comment here. You mentioned this term redlining. Can you explain this term more and what we as planners need to think about when it comes to revitalizing previously neglected parts of our cities?
Yeah, I mentioned redlining, I believe, in the context of South Bend. But so redlining is the practice of systematically denying capital for development, mortgage loans, things like that, to certain areas based on geographic criteria. And so it comes from the practice of that really originated in the 1930s and 1940s of drawing a red line on a map around neighborhoods that were considered hazardous investments. And those tended to be neighborhoods dominated by people of color. Certainly not exclusively, but they tended to be, and they tended to be lower income areas. And because of the patterns of where wealth was distributed at the time, they tended to be what would be urban infill areas. So large portions of America's cities essentially had that spigot of capital for incremental reinvestment shut off on them during that era. Federal mortgage redlining doesn't happen in the ways that it did back then. There was a period when the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't insure mortgages in what they deemed to be hazardous areas, which tended to be these low-income neighborhoods of color. But banks still engage in this practice today. You can see dramatic disparities in access to capital along geographic lines that aren't all that different from the ones you see on the old homeowners loan corporation redlining maps from the 30s. So I think planners should be attuned to that. And some of it is outside of the direct domain of city planning, sort of narrowly conceived. But I think what's going on in South Bend is one model for how do you respond to that today, where you look at, in terms of your economic development efforts, you look at what are these neighborhoods that have historically been denied access to capital, and what are the needs of the people living in these neighborhoods, and how can we help them realize that, and how can we facilitate redressing some of these historic wrongs in a way that is really going to be led by the people in these places. So, one thing that South Bend is looking at doing, for example, is using city resources to essentially partner with local banks for a revolving loan fund for small developers and to buy down the interest rate to make this, to create a lower cost of financing. So you could get gap financing for, a business, an old rehabilitation project in a commercial space in one of these historically redlined neighborhoods. And maybe with the help of the city, we can make that a 2% loan instead of an 8% loan. So that's an example of where the public sector really has a direct role to play in facilitating the reinvestment of capital into these places, and in a bottom-up way that isn't extractive, that isn't large outside developers coming in and sort of wiping the slate clean, but is incremental development led by people with a stake in these neighborhoods.
I would be interested to hear how one might apply a strong towns approach to developing technologies and to the future. I think in a lot of ways, future technologies are often kind of a chicken and egg situation where, we need users to demonstrate the desire for them, but we also need investment to create the infrastructure to allow the users to use them. I'm thinking electrification for, electric vehicles. There is, a commercial and consumer push for it, but in a lot of ways it still requires, top-down investment in infrastructure that maybe isn't organic or, kind of incremental.
Yeah, well, with something like electrification, there's a fundamental scale problem there where, the technology is only useful if you have enough charging stations, and there are certain aspects of the infrastructure that they need to be deployed at scale in order to be useful. So I understand that. I think a lot of this stuff is coming, whether kind of regardless of what cities do. I think the public sector needs to have a role in rolling out some of it, but I think, to me, I have less of a firm take on how to do that rollout or that facilitation. And to me, it's more of a cautionary tale of just don't fail to keep your eyes on the prize of what makes for a place that we know works and that we know is resilient and that we know is time tested. So the fundamental mistake of the suburban experiment was taking a new technology that had a whole lot of promise and upending the development pattern of a whole continent based on accommodating this new technology. That's the thing that we need to learn from. So electrification is great. Autonomous vehicles, you know, they have ups and downs, and to some extent, some of the technology is coming either way. But what we know is that we have a template from thousands of years of human history for how you produce a place that has a certain complexity and adaptability and that meets human needs. And that approach is the traditional model of development, which is scaled to people who are on foot and which has a fine grain, which is built by many hands. And we know how to do that. And as long as humans are bipedal 5 to 6 foot tall mammals who walk on 2 feet, I mean, it's going to continue to be successful to create places that are scaled to people who walk on 2 feet. So I think that technology shouldn't distract us from that. That doesn't mean we don't embrace it, we don't accommodate it, but what makes a productive place is not likely to change based on new emerging transportation technologies. The automobile didn't change what made a productive place. It just distracted us for multiple generations from the task of creating those productive places.
I do have one more, and that piggybacks on your answer there, Daniel. It's so we have this legacy of multiple generations of non-productive places that have been built, and which constitute probably more than half of the built environment in the country right now. You used the word retrofitting earlier with relationship to Strodes, and there's kind of an argument among planners now as to the viability of actually retrofitting suburbs in these places that are not built well, you know, speaking objectively. And then on the other side, people are saying, well, no, let's just concentrate on infill. These places are literally lost causes. With regards to the use of the word retrofitting in suburbia and Strodes, what are your thoughts there as to the viability of that? I know it obviously is going to be different from case to case, but do you have a general sense for that?
I think that allow it to happen in incremental and improvisational ways, and where it's viable and where it isn't is something that will kind of become clear over time. And my guess is that a retrofitted mid-century suburb is not going to look like the towns that we were building on the frontier in the 1880s. It's going to look like something completely different. But people already do, quote unquote, retrofit these environments out of desperation. So an example is you can visit suburbs all over America where you drive down a street of single family homes and there are 4 or 5 cars in every driveway and front yard, because who's living in that home is a multi-generational household, maybe an immigrant family, people who are kind of stretching their means that way. You know, we have built so much of these suburban templates to the point where our built environment is kind of a mismatch for our needs as well as for what proves to be financially productive. So the statistic I'm familiar with is that 4 out of 5 US households are something other than a nuclear family. They might be a blended or a multi-generational family. They might be people living with roommates. They might be couples without kids, single people, but there's something other than the traditional nuclear family, 4 out of 5. And yet more than 80% of the residential land area in most of our cities is reserved for single family homes. And some very large percentage, I don't know the number offhand, of our housing stock is single family detached homes. And so there's an obvious mismatch there. And people respond by adapting to the built environment that exists, even if it's not the one that might better serve their needs. So I think there probably are places that have been built that are lost causes. And that's in a fiscal sense, in a sense of, can we maintain everything that we have built, all of these roads, all of these pipes? Because ultimately, if we cannot financially do so, then the reality is that we won't. But we're not going to write off places and say, sorry, you don't get your road repaved anymore. You know, you don't get your sewer main fixed. With that's a political conversation that is pretty untenable in most places. To simply say, sorry, the place where you live, we have deemed unproductive. You know, it's not going to happen that way. I think what's going to happen is a whole lot messier than that. And I think the key to a strong towns approach to quote unquote retrofit is to allow people to adapt the built environment of the place they already live to meet their needs, but not throw subsidy and throw resources at the problem of sprawl retrofit. Recognize that some places are going to adapt well and some places aren't, and maybe they will decline, and maybe a certain number of people will move away from them. You know, we may have a lot of Detroits in our future, and I think that's the sobering reality. And they won't be Detroit. They'll be places whose builders 20, 30, 40 years ago never imagined them as going the way of Detroit.